Hi friends, welcome to Growing as Grown-Ups, where we believe each of us has the opportunity to keep growing in ways that can fundamentally improve our life effectiveness, our leadership influence, and our well-being. Through interviews, stories, and practical principles, we explore how you can accelerate your growth and unlock your potential to make the difference you want to make. And now, your hosts from the Leaders Lyceum, Dr. Sarah Musgrove and Dr. Keith Eigel.
Sarah, everybody, welcome to the Growing as Grown-Ups podcast. Sarah, I am so excited about today's interview. One of my favorites. You interviewed Jason Young, and I've known Jason for the better part of a decade. We both have known him for 6 or 7 years since he came through the Lyceum with a group from an organization called Point Ministries, where Jason served as the head of what is known as guest services. And that may not sound like a big deal to a lot of people, but Jason's span of influence was over 1,800 volunteers. And I started thinking about, well, how can we equate that to what that means for people who work in maybe more traditional work settings and in corporate America? And I looked up from the North American Industry Classification System, sort of our national business statistical arm that classifies jobs and all these kinds of things. And do you know that 90% of all businesses have less than 1,000 employees, and about 80% of all businesses have less than 4? Right.
What?
So we're talking,
Wow.
The scale at which Jason was leading was like the VP, SVP, EVP of a Fortune 500 organization in some ways. Wow. Right. And even though I want you to tell them more about what Jason is doing right now and how he's leveraged that influence into what he's doing now. Mm-hmm. But my point is, Jason knows his stuff and he's proven his stuff. Yeah. Right. So tell our audience a little bit about where Jason's gone over the last several years.
Yeah. So Jason went back and got his doctorate in hospitality. So that's really where he specializes, in creating these experiences for people that make them feel welcome, that make them want to come back. And so he's written 4 books. He's an author, he's a speaker, he's about to be a podcaster, with really trying to get this mission out of how do you lead in a way that inspires volunteers to want to serve under you and creates environments where your guests or your customers want to come back. And I love that everything he talks about in our interview about how to lead a volunteer, to me, sounds like the same things I would want people who lead paid employees, people who lead friends and family, anyone that wants to have influence. What Jason has to say is relevant and applicable and deeply true. And I just think he has so much unique experience and perspective to bring that I want everyone to listen to this podcast.
Yeah, me too. And we often say in the programs that we run, in the coaching work that we do, that the best leaders are really adept at meeting others where they are and leading them where they need them to go. And Jason, just the way he talks about empathy, the way he talks about identifying people's feelings, the way he even talks about tying it to a larger purpose that moves people as opposed to just the tasks that need to be done. I just think, let's just jump in.
Jason Young, welcome to the Growing as Grown-Ups podcast. We are so excited to have you with us today. So we have known you for a number of years. You came through our program back in, 2014, maybe 2015.
Yep. Somewhere
back a
around
number
that.
of years ago. And your life has kind of pivoted a little bit. You've gone a little more specialized in some things. And so we wanted to bring you on today to just pull some of your wisdom out on the things that you have learned on how do you lead people who are not direct reports, people who don't have to follow you, right? Which is a terrible way to think of leadership, as people who have to follow you. But that's what you've really done with your professional career over these years. And so that is what we want to talk about today. But let me just throw out kind of a starter question, because I've found that everybody defines this word differently. So how do you, Dr. Young, how do you define leadership?
I don't know. No, I, on one hand, I don't know. On the other hand, I think I do know. It's interesting. This is a long answer to your question, but I'm fascinated by how many different definitions and why people define it in the way that they do. So on one hand, I don't know because there are so many. Yeah. On the other hand, I think, leadership might be described as a few things. And again, I didn't come up with these. I do think leadership is this ability to not influence people to get them to do what you want them to do, but I think leadership is influence to help them, see the more that they could become, to see the more that they could do, things along that line. I think leadership, really one of the key characteristics of a leader is how are they able to demonstrate empathy, which feels like a super soft word. But it's an intentional effort to like feel and understand people and take into consideration where they are in life, their experience, all of those types of things, which requires a leader to slow down in order to do that. So for me, I don't know that I could come up with some probably decent definition, but I see it as more as descriptors of somebody who influences people to help them see they could be and do more. A leader, somebody who approaches people with great empathy. And then I think a leader, in addition, is somebody who puts intentional effort on caring for their own life. And I don't mean that selfishly, but kind of do, on an emotional health, mental health, physical boundaries, not available 24 hours a day, which sometimes is a struggle for me, let's be honest.
Yeah.
So I think these are maybe some things that leaders do, and maybe that can be created into some super cute definition of leadership. I just don't know. I mean, I want to be like a lot of these other leaders and have a definition, but I think mine would be more of describing what I just described.
Yeah, what they do. I love that. I think that's a great way to look at it. So when you think about the things that leaders do that you believe characterize good leaders, is there somebody that comes to mind that you think of as a role model for you of a good leader?
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple, and I mean, I won't go on about all of them. And I think that they do a lot of things well, but if I had to pick one thing well that they do, I think of, Andy Stanley. And I think the thing that I can speak about personally, I reported to him for a bit while I was, working at Point Ministries. The thing that impressed me is that he has an ability to trust you with responsibility. And I think that is what a great leader does, is they don't have to control everything. They don't have to micromanage everything. They're clear. They have expectations, but they give it to you and they trust you to deliver. And if you don't, there's a conversation. If you do, there's a, celebration. But I think he does that well. I think there are leaders from a distance, that do things well. I think another guy that used to be a boss, he's not as known as Andy, is Chris Green. You probably know him, maybe, through Lyceum. But I think he's another guy that is just super encouraging and gives you the space to think and create and do. And if it doesn't, we retool, and move forward. But I think it's also one of those things that he asks you about you. I know he values doing, but he asks you about you and he asks you about your family. And so we're friends to this day. So I think, just if I were to give two quick examples, Andy and Chris.
Yeah, that's awesome. They are both really admirable people. So I love that you picked out them as your examples. Now, maybe a little more of a personal question. Do you have any sort of leadership lessons that you have learned in your life that you would want to share with other people, but maybe it's a lesson you learned the hard way, something that you did that didn't work out, or a failed leading attempt at anything?
Yeah. So there are two. Maybe we have time for one. I think back up years ago, I thought because I have an opinion, that opinion always has to be expressed. And what I learned is that is not helpful. And you're like, well, golly, how long did it take you to learn that? Probably too long. But I think as leaders, what I didn't pay attention to, Sarah, is I spent more time talking than I did listening. And what I realized is that other people treated me the same way. And I didn't like it. And why I couldn't put two and two together is just beyond me. And I think the more I don't know, grew, I really worked hard and kind of on my own emotional intelligence and just navigating some of those spaces. And it really occurred to me that I talk more than I listen. So I need to grow in that. And every time I think of something, an opinion or perspective or insight, I actually don't always have to share it, because what it eventually did is it alienated people, or you might not get invited to meetings, or people see you as a know-it-all or arrogant. And I'm like, why would they do that? Oh, well, you're right. I would too if I did that. So I think that's a thing as a leader I learned, is to listen more than I talk. I don't always have to share everything. Ask questions. I can always wish I had said something, but if I said it, I can't take it back. And so it's just navigating, maybe it comes down, maybe the denominator about all those things is making wiser decisions as a leader, and remembering that every single one of those decisions, it does have an emotional impact on somebody else.
Wow, Jason, those are great. And there's like all these questions are running through my head now that I'm like, want to ask you follow-up questions, but I want to get to the meat of what you are really here to talk about, which is this idea of leading volunteers. And so will you just give us a little bit of background from your perspective on how you got to the point that this is something that you are so passionate about?
Yeah. So, a lot of my work has been in, church background, and by default, you have volunteers. And so whether I started out very, very beginning, I worked with students, and you had volunteers that helped you lead students, to, other areas where I really have spent most of my career and most of my time, and where I'm passionate about is volunteers who are on the front lines, who help create experiences for the guest. By guest, I mean really anybody that comes into your building, first time or 100th time, they're a guest, is in my mind. And so I think in working with those individuals, I learned that they are way more than in my early career I credit them to be. And I need to invest in them way more than just getting them to, quote, do something on that Saturday or Sunday service. So yeah, most of it in church world, and maybe, your listeners, some are in church world, some are nonprofits, some, schools, if you volunteer at a school and you have other volunteers you lead, but volunteers are in a lot of places, and how you lead them is very interesting, especially if you're trying to lead them the same way that you do a paid person. There could be some challenges.
So go further with that. What is the same and what is different when you're leading somebody who you are paying, they kind of have to be there, they're assigned to you, versus somebody that you are getting who is choosing to follow you?
Yeah. So, the number one thing people will usually say about volunteers, the difference is, well, one's paid and one's not. And that is like absolutely true. What's interesting about that, though, I didn't learn this till years after leading volunteers and then, leading paid staff members. Paid staff members are actually somewhat volunteers too, because they could leave
For sure,
if they wanted to.
For sure.
So there is a little bit of like similarities and the differences. So the one thing, yes, they're paid, so the expectations are different. I say that the way maybe you handle the expectations in that individual are different. The types of communication you have, you feel like you have a greater weight and money is attached to it. So if I'm sitting down and think, okay, if I don't get paid, I've got a wife and 2 kids. They got to eat. We got to pay mortgage. We got, so I might not say something I really want to say because I don't want to jeopardize. So there is a little bit of you maybe process, not all employees, but you process a little bit, differently. When I think about a volunteer, I would say this: a volunteer is not there to do what I want them to do, paid or not. Okay, volunteer, not paid, right? Let's go with that. They're not there to achieve Jason's agenda. They're not there to achieve your agenda. Even though you are the paid person, that is not why they are there. However, that is very normal. I have a job, I'm get paid for expectations, I manage those. One of the ways to manage those, I need people, volunteer comes in, we're going to do ABC, you're going to help me do it, we're going to call it a day, I'm going to be great, the leader's going to like me, my boss is going to reward me, I'm going to get a raise, and I'm, all this. Silly example, but pretty normal.
Yeah.
But if you think about a volunteer differently, even from the moment, even before they're on your team, that's where things change. So instead of going, well, I have an agenda, I need you on my team. What I think sometimes we miss in the life of a volunteer is you do know volunteers have needs too. And so I think it's slowing down long enough to go, I'm actually here to help you and not going to focus on the other way around as the primary. Yes, we do help each other. But I think sometimes we forget that the volunteer has needs. What motivates somebody to volunteer? Why do they want to volunteer with you? There's all these types of questions. So long answer to say, the difference in a paid person and a volunteer, yes, is money. That's a no-brainer. But I think it's you could still care about somebody the same. You could still reward somebody. Again, it may not be monetarily, but it could be other ways. You can have expectations. And so again, the employee volunteers to show up every day. Yes, there's money attached, but they could leave, And so I think, and we may talk about this a little bit more, but I think there's some ways that you can interview a volunteer, onboard a volunteer, train a volunteer, coach a volunteer. And to me, those are 2 different things. Develop a volunteer, remove a volunteer. I think there are stages that all of those have to be part of the plan if you want to create the best volunteer culture, which should be the goal. Not to have the most, but to have the healthiest volunteer culture.
I think that touches on something that I love about the work of yours that I've seen is that I think too many times I've been a volunteer where I am just some little piece that they're trying to move around to get something done.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, okay, I'm whatever you need me to do, I'll do it. But for you to flip it around and say, we need to pay attention to the volunteers as people with needs, with values, with reasons, with motivations. And how do we make this experience meaningful to them and still get the work done? Right. And so I'm wondering for you, like, how do you find that balance where in so many cases, volunteers are there because there is so much to be done that the staff can't handle it, that the work needs to be done. And I need to find people to choose to be there and work hard and still feel valued. Like where's the balance? And how do you do the part that gets more overlooked, which is the human side of it?
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to tell you I'm great at any or all of it. But I do work hard in it and on it. So for me, it's super intentional. I think both are needed, but it depends on which one you lead with, with the person. And look, people, if you're listening to this, people are not dumb. They can quickly assess who you are and what you want from them and how, if you're using them or not. In fact, there's been opportunities for me and I will sense from somebody, you just want to use me. So yeah. Sarah, back up years ago. So let's see, I've been doing this, 20 plus years. I remember right when I started, I didn't know, but I had goals and objectives and I'm pretty driven. And I used volunteers to get things done. And now that I look back, I'm like, oh, why would I ever do that? You know, and when my eyes were opened, it's like, okay, it took a lot of effort. And so, yes, do volunteers help you get things done? Yes. If a volunteer is great, they're going to want to do. So the doing is not, I'm not saying the doing is not important. It's very important. What I am saying is you have to prevent people from feeling used. And that is not always, mostly not on them to figure out. That's on you, the leader, to figure out. And so how do you do that? I think you can, again, start in the very beginning. So how do we bring people on the team? What do we do? How do we make decisions? Training. For me, training is what do we do in the first 90 days to help you be successful? Then development starts on day 91. We're going to help you for a bigger picture. But when you're here on this team, I used to give this wooden plaque to all of our leaders, and it was the word beyond. It was a way for them to know Jason's heart is Jason's going to invest in me beyond what I can do, quote, for him.
Mm.
And so I'm going to help you in your personal life, because when you're in a board meeting on Tuesday and you're the CEO of a company, or you're a mechanic and on Thursday you're with a customer, how can we help in our training, not just so you're great on, at your, volunteer role, but that you could be great at your job on Monday or Tuesday, or at home as a mom or dad. If you're a single parent and you got to make decisions, there's something that we helped in our training, that we gave in our training to help you in your everyday life. When that happens, that person feels that you care about them. And what do you think they want to do? They want to do better and be better. Well, that makes the work better. I will tell you this, Sarah, it takes an enormous amount of time. It takes resources. So if you're a leader listening to this and you're not willing to resource it, that's going to be a real problem. You say, well, I don't have a lot of resources. I think evaluating the resources that you do have and allocating it appropriately tells the volunteer, but tells the team around you, whether it's another person or 100 people, this is important. These people are important. This is what we're going to do. So I think having a plan, I think I wrote a book, The Volunteer Effect, I don't even remember when it came out last year. I should remember. Pandemic has shocked me. My advice, don't release 2 books in a pandemic. So it was a real challenge, but in one of them, it talked about, how to having a plan. And I think as the leader has a plan for the volunteer, and, the leader has a plan for themselves. And I think investing in them beyond the role with time, money, conversations, be interested genuinely in their personal life. And this is, I'm gonna say this is not super popular, because I get flack for this, maybe more than anything, on the volunteer space. I don't think all volunteers should stay on your team.
Ooh, all right. Tell me more.
Yeah. So this is tough, because if you work in a nonprofit or a church or wherever you may have volunteers, your supervisor or the CEO or senior pastor, whatever, they may say, hey, whoever comes in, they've got to be on your team. And what happens is you get stuck with some real challenges. And if you're a volunteer somewhere listening to this, paid staff people talk about volunteers. And we talk about primarily the ones who are a real challenge. And sometimes the ones who are a real challenge don't even know that they're a real challenge, which is part of the problem.
Exactly.
And so sometimes I think what you have to do, that's where starting at the beginning helps. It doesn't cure everything, but it sure does help, because when it comes to a conversation that isn't hard, when you've talked about, values in the interview, and you've talked about it in the onboarding, and you've trained, you've done these pieces well, it makes the conversation not easier, but easier, because you can talk about it from hey, remember when we talked about the values, and we talked about great attitude? Well, and then you explain whatever situation was. It kind of, and you agreed to the great attitude, like, is there's like something happening that, we may not know. And sometimes that was the case. I'd have these conversations all the time. Sometimes it was a life situation or work situation, and it carried over, and we talked through it. I remember one guy, he kind of rebounded and was struggling with alcohol again. And he was coming out angry with other volunteers. And we talked through that. And man, I just pressed in. He stayed on the team. We had great conversations. It wasn't easy, but we talked about it because we had done this process well. I think some volunteers don't need to stay on the team, especially if they're not going to, if they're not coachable, if they're costing your team more than you can afford. If other people, here's a great indicator. How do you know if a volunteer, if you need to have a conversation with a volunteer or maybe even remove them from your team, if other good volunteers around them are leaving your team, that is a great cue.
Yeah.
In fact, you're too late at that point. Maybe not too late, you're late. So you got to stay ahead of these things because, again, I'm willing to make one or two volunteers really mad on a team and they're going to talk smack about me, totally fine. But I'm also willing to protect the other 37 because they didn't sign up for that and I'm not going to allow it to happen. So again, that doesn't mean you do it instantly, which I have done before because it was such a pretty big offense. But normally it's this process. And so I think not all volunteers should stay on the team.
Jason, I can't help but think as you're talking about all of this, how everything you're saying applies to leadership in any context, right? And maybe it's because I work primarily with organizations that have paid employees, but it's like everything that you're saying about how you encourage people to lead volunteers is how I think about years ago when I worked at Starbucks, right? And how as the frontline barista at a Starbucks, like the same things that I needed from my leader and I got from my leader, I had a really great boss there, were just what you're saying and communicating the values and that not everybody needs to be there. Not everybody's suited for the role. And so I'm just wondering, in your experience and now that you've been doing some more consulting work kind of outside of the ministry, do you see these things apply more broadly or is it really targeted just for volunteers?
No, it's people. So, it's people. I mean, if I'm working with a Fortune, 500 or 100 client to, a church or a nonprofit, I mean, people are people. And, there are some nuances, I think, that could be highlighted in the volunteer space that would be, unlikely a little bit in the paid employee space. But I think it might just be a different version. Because again, people, the common denominator, people, I tell people this, and this is so great for me to remember. When you're on a company team, and they want you to, treat the client or customer or church attendee, whatever language you use, a certain way, you feel like, wow, leadership should treat us that way. They should model, what they, and it's like, okay, exactly. If you lead volunteers, it's no different. If you think about a volunteer and you want them to interface with kindness, listening, empathy, hyper responsiveness, fully present, all of these things, you want them to do that. You have to do that. Now, here is probably the number one difference between a paid employee and a volunteer: the number of reps that you get. And the number of reps, often you can work through things faster. So, if I'm working with Sarah Monday through Friday, we may have 10 opportunities that week. If I have a volunteer that's every other week, and if they miss one because of vacation and they miss another one because they're sick, now we're week 4, week 6. So the reps, and so you have to just factor that into the plan. And so that's where the coaching and the intentional effort and giving more away to leaders and empowering them and framework, all of those things really do matter. And so again, yes, people are people, very similar issues. The nuances are slightly different. But I think how you want them to treat the guest or, client or customer, they need to feel that from you, and it can't be accidental, or it's going to be delivered accidentally to the guest. And then you can't correct them because you're not modeling that. And so whatever you want them to model, I mean, a volunteer reproduces what they experience.
Yeah. I mean,
And same
again,
thing with an employee.
same for employees. Yeah. So
Absolutely.
one thing that you talk about in the volunteer effect that I just love was this idea of creating kind of the mission for the smaller team, right? We
Mm.
talk a lot about organizational values, organizational mission, but you talk about the importance of, like, you want me to come help you park cars outside of a big event. Tell me why I should stand outside and do that.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of times a church or a nonprofit will use their stage, and that could be physical or digital, to invite people to do something. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But I think figuring out people are different and trying to talk the language of this differing audience is key. So for some doers, they just want you, what do you want me to do? You know, I don't give me all the fluff. Don't get, just what do you want me to do? Right? It's just like execute. And then there's other people that, you know, they need something totally different. So for example, if I stand on stage and, hey, we're having an event this Friday night. We are expecting 1,000 people. It looks like we're going to need 12 people in the parking lot. Sign up, you know, in the back or text in, whatever. Well, I mean, okay, you have an event and you have a need. Not super inspiring. But if you said differently, you said, this Friday night, we have an opportunity to host something for our city. I'm just making, literally, if you're listening, I'm making this up. But on Friday night, we have something we're hosting for our city. And it gives us a great opportunity to, one, showcase the care that we can provide. It gives, for many of these 1,000 people, roughly 70% of them have never stepped foot in a church. So we get to not only showcase how we care, we get to give people an appropriate picture of how the church cares, this church cares in the community. But not only that, we get to, on a basic need, we just get to see people, speak to people, acknowledge people, listen to people, remove obstacles for people, because we want to support the work that this, you know, let's say that this partner or whoever's sponsoring the event, or maybe it is the church, is doing. And so, oh, and by the way, so really the task is the by the way. So where do you come into play? Well, maybe you'd be interested in helping us safely guide people so they can get inside our building. I mean, you can say parking, but I think parking is functional. And I used to tell our parking team, you're not parking cars, you're guiding people. And behind the windshield is a person that has feelings, that maybe it's a couple. This used to happen all the time. They smile when they get to church because they, God forbid, people know that they fight, or their marriage is hanging by a thread, or their kids are making them nuts. Okay, kids, you're going to like being here. You're going to smile, you know, and it's like, we're going to put this on. And so when you think about people on the other side, maybe they just got the promotion they've always wanted. Maybe their family member died of COVID. Maybe they lost not only their first job, but their second job. I read an article this week about Broadway, and for many in Broadway, they've lost 2 jobs. They lost the Broadway job, and they may have had a second job as a barista, bartender, whatever it was, but they lost that because their restaurant closed. You know, so you got all of these people, highs and lows. They just finalized their adoption of their new daughter. They just got married. I mean, there's people all over the spectrum. But when you posture yourself in such a way that that is why you're there, you get to be an opportunity to care, and that changes the way people experience. And so always think about it this way. The people before the stage, so say a physical stage in a building, the people before the stage and after the stage, the bookend, they really set the temperature of the experience that people will have. And either when anything else happens on that stage, if it's good, it won't be a distraction. But if it's bad, it's a distraction. And so that parking person, you are contributing. You are setting up, and you are giving this, as Horst Schultze, Ritz Carlton says, you're giving this fond farewell when people leave. And remember, when people choose to do business with you or to volunteer with you, they do so because it feels right. It feels different. They make a lot. You say, well, they shouldn't make decisions off feeling. You can argue it till the cows come home. But more times than not, people make decisions based on feeling. That's why really that's why my second book, The Comeback Effect, was affect a guest enough, they want to come back. Affect a volunteer enough that they too want to come back. And then you begin to head towards creating a culture that, people want to come back to.
Yeah. I mean, I just love that. And again, it's just it's a human thing, right? As you said, like,
Yeah.
people want to know how they fit in. They want to be doing something meaningful. They want to know that they're contributing to something significant.
Yeah.
And to communicate, I don't need you to stand in a parking lot. I need you to help guide people safely so that they can come and know that they're loved, right? Like,
Yeah.
sign me up for
Yeah.
that. All right, I'll stand out
Yeah.
in the rain. But I think about when I worked at Starbucks, right? Like, your job is to help people start their morning out with a smile on their face, right?
Mm.
Yes, I'm making 1,000 lattes for cranky people, but can they leave with a smile on their face, right? And
Yeah.
I think the more frontline employees that people are leading, like, they're the ones that sometimes get the most distant from kind of the leadership, the senior leadership, but they're the ones who are exhibiting the company, the face of the company. And so they
Yeah.
need to understand that, they need the values. And I just think that's such a cool way to think about it. Does every person know how their role is making a difference for the customer? And I love the way you say, like, how are they going to feel? Like, how do you want the people you're interacting with to feel? How do you want your customers to feel? How do you want your guests to feel? And everybody can name that instead of, I think our company value is like integrity and work hard, right? And they're
Yeah.
like, how does that apply to my job? I love that.
Well, I remember this one, it was raining and the parking team was going out to work in the rain. I think it was cold too. It was the day that it would have been
You
perfect to
don't
call
want to
in
be in the
sick.
parking lot. Yeah.
No, you're like, oh, feel like I should be doing something else. But what was amazing is all of the other volunteers that were on the inside knew where the parking team was meeting. And so what we did is we created this tunnel, kind of like, this cheer tunnel, if you will. And it was something so small, but what it said to the parking team was all the inside volunteers see us. Really, that's what it said. They see us and they support us. And man, when I went outside that day, because I think on those days it's important to see the leader. So I need to be out there too. It put a pep in their step. And so I think for whether you lead volunteers or paid staff people, it doesn't take a lot, huge thing, but little things really do matter. But I think more than anything, people want to know, do you see me? Do you see what I do? Do you see who I am? Versus just that I'm here to do the same thing over and over and over again. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you think that you're doing. What matters is how they feel about what you're doing. And sometimes those are very different. And then other times they're very, very much the same.
So good, Jason. I love it. There's so many things I could ask you, but for the sake of the time, we will start wrapping up. So you've got a lot going on. You've got some new stuff coming out like right now.
Yeah.
Early May is big for you. So tell me what's going on in life right now that you are excited about.
So I think probably a couple of things. One, I have, the marketing agency I'm working with says it's a new brand. I'm not great at all this stuff, just to be honest with you, but I've always kind of done the Jason Young live thing. It's been social and website and all that. But I'm moving over to something that's called Catch Fire. And the idea is everybody needs a little bit of a spark in their marriage, spark at home, spark at work, spark in our leadership, spark with the team, spark with ideas, spark on caring for guests, whatever the spark is. But if you could just start with a spark, eventually it'll catch fire. And so that's the kind of the idea of the brand. And so that launches, beginning of May, Lord willing, and there'll be a podcast. I've never done that before. I kind of put it off and didn't think, I don't know. A lot of people were doing it and I just didn't. But I think the timing is good. And so all things will switch. The new website will be Catch Fire Daily. I send out this thing every other Saturday right now. It'll change, but it's just, aggregated content on hospitality and leadership. It's free. So right now it's jasonyounglive.com, but you'll see a Saturday rundown is there. So I'm excited about that. I have 2 books that come out next year. So those will be primarily focused on the business space. And so, yeah, those are kind of some things I'm excited about today.
That's a lot of things to be excited about, and welcome to the podcast club.
Thank you.
Fun. So you've got all this new brand coming out. This podcast will be airing in May when this stuff is hopefully live. We'll make sure to include all the current links. But if people want to learn more about you, where can they find you?
Yeah, well, I'd say there's a right now and there's a later. A right now, so if you're, if the web interests you, it's jasonyounglive, live.com. People say, how'd you come up with that? Jason Young was taken, and live was another option, and all social channels were available too. So any social channel is the same, Jason Young Live. So I've been taking a little bit of a social breather to work on some projects and just create a little separation. I think it's healthy from time to time, at least for me. Yeah. But yeah, so on the web or social channels, you can catch me there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We will definitely keep in touch. And when your new books come out, we will let our audience know about those. But thank you so much for your time. It was so great to talk to you and to get this kind of fun, different perspective on leading people who don't have to follow you, and making them want to come, and making their lives better by being a part of your work. And I just think that's really, really great. So thank you so much for your time. And we will talk again.
Thanks for letting me be on. Yeah. All right. See you soon.
Sarah, once again, a great interview. I mean, the guest made it pretty easy this time, but I'm still giving you props for your interview skills. So good.
Thank you. But yeah, Jason was so great.
Yeah. Hey, listen, we don't need to, I don't feel like we need to kind of rehash our favorite quotes from the interview. Everybody just got to hear them. I think for me, I wanted us to spend a little bit of our time at the tail end of this thing just talking about the importance, how much sense it makes in a way to really focus on meeting people that you have influence with where they are, and in order to lead them where you need them to go. And the way that we meet people where they are is to listen well, to be empathetic, to put ourselves in their shoes, to explore beyond when we think we've got it until it's when they think we've got it, right? I don't know if that makes sense. You might want to clarify that a little bit. But my gosh, Jason, if you knew him and understood his drive and his strategic orientation to the world, to hear somebody do nothing but talk about people for 35 or 40 minutes was totally amazing.
Yeah. And that's something that we have the luxury of knowing about Jason outside of this podcast. But I did ask him about that after we stopped recording. And so, he talked about how early on in his leadership, he was much more strategic, much more driven, much more accomplish the goals, get everything done, keep moving forward. And he learned the hard way, like so many of us do, that just pushing hard into your strengths isn't enough. And he took time and really intentionally dug into kind of the emotional side of leadership, the softer skills of leadership, and realized that the best way to accomplish goals and to be an effective leader is through the people, by taking the time to value them, to understand, like he said, people don't volunteer because they want to fulfill my agenda. They're there because they want something for themselves. And you need to take the time to get to know them. And the idea of people just want to know, do you see me? Right. And that's a really simple way to say what you were saying of meet them where they are, which means you have to see them on their good days, on their bad days. You have to know what matters to them. You have to be willing to sit with them when things aren't going well, to give them hard feedback, all those different things. I think Jason does such a good job living because he's learned just the value of that and the importance of that. And now it's become such a core value to him that you can't imagine him leading any other way.
Yeah. Right. I mean, that was evident through the whole interview. You know, I don't know how many of our listeners to the podcast are what we would call intuitive thinkers in kind of Jungian type theory. So whether you've taken the Golden with us, or you've taken the Myers-Briggs, or whether you've taken the DISC, it would equate to being like a high D on the DISC. It is this strategist, driver, task-oriented more than people-oriented kind of focus. And a lot of times for those people, what they really need to connect with is how connecting with others actually makes sense in helping them better achieve their goals. And the fact that not only did Jason make that linkage, but that he went and got a doctorate in hospitality. Right. Yeah. I mean, it is when you take that kind of high D personality, that strategist personality, and you do that, folks, if that's the world, if that's kind of your orientation and where you live, what you need to do is learn how it makes sense to take the time that you feel like you don't have, to focus on people, to listen longer than you think you need to listen, because people who are built the way Jason's built normally know where people are going when they tell them something. And so they tend to cut them off really quickly. So even though they may have heard and guessed or intuited or whatever where the person was going, the person doesn't feel heard. So they don't stay engaged in the same way. But to actually listen longer than you need to make sure that you've got it right, to give people back what you've heard them saying, it actually makes tremendous sense. It actually makes you more effective and gets you to the goal more quickly as a leader in a way that makes people feel valued, in a way that actually, I'll go further than that, actually values people, right? And it's, again, I think for me, that's why I love this. That's why I love this interview so much.
Yeah. I agree. And I think he does such a good job. And, you know, I've read part of his book, The Volunteer Effect, where he goes into more detail and more kind of tips and strategies about how to be that kind of leader. And so I would encourage, even if you're not leading volunteers, I would encourage our listeners to go check that out. The first chapter of it is free on his website, jasonyounglive.com. His new website, Catch Fire Daily, is being launched as well. And so there's a lot that people can learn from that, and just the importance of paying attention to people. And one thing I do want to reinforce that I love so much about his work is, in the spirit of meeting people where they are, it's casting the vision for where you want to go in a way that is mission oriented, impact oriented, instead of results oriented, right? Just even the simple example of, I'm not parking cars, I'm guiding people into an experience where they are going to be encouraged, right? Like how many customer service representatives do you interact with and you get annoyed because it's like their job is to read the script and to close the deal, right? And it's like, oh, but what if, from the person answering the phones to the leader of the organization, it was, I knew that my job was to make people feel a certain way, which then transfers down to the results. But I love that, the way that he frames making the mission relevant to each specific person in their role and how they're contributing to it. And that's just one of those leadership principles that I'm like, I hope everybody helps their employees, their coworkers see that picture.
Yeah. Do you know, Sarah, I have a friend of mine that was volunteered under Jason at Buckhead Church. And this person made an amount of money that he could have hired the whole parking team to just come in and take care of things. But if you asked him, he would say that what he got to do on Sundays, helping park cars, which was very different than what he did the rest of his week, right? Was one of the more meaningful parts of his week, right? And it was Jason's ability to kind of tie this to the way that you're making a difference. So there are those two pieces. It's understanding where the person that's following you is coming from, but it's also tying it to things that you're more capable of understanding what's meaningful to them when you understand where they're coming from, right? And all this is knit together. And one of the things that I thought both of you guys did brilliantly in the interview, and you really pushed in that direction, is that Jason's advice is way beyond volunteers, right?
For sure.
Technically, every employee that reports to you is kind of a volunteer because most people have the choice to leave.
Yeah.
You know, and you've heard the stats that most people don't leave their job, they leave their leader, right? And so that's my challenge to folks that are listening is how do you begin to bring some of the things that Jason talked about that you kind of tied back into the more corporate settings? How do you bring that to the influences that you have? And by the way, earlier in our either setup or debrief, you said, and even if you're just wanting to have influence with a family, right? This applies. It's really good stuff. So way to go. I hope that folks enjoyed this. You know, we've got resources that tie you back into ways to evaluate yourself, to look at yourself. Reach out to us if you have questions about any of this. Go to growinggrownups.com. You can get us there. Sarah, really fun time.
Yeah.
Fun interview, fun podcast. Way to go.
Thank you. We'll see you all in 2 weeks with our next episode.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Growing as Grown-ups. Take a second and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any future episodes, and tell your friends. You'll find all of the goods related to this episode, including the transcript, videos, links, and other ways we can help you keep growing as a grown-up on our website, growinggrownups.com. Growth isn't easy, but it's completely within your reach. Until next time, journey well, friends.